The sheriff told her to go home and let the men handle it. She put her boot through his office door instead. That's how most people in Harlan County, Wyoming remembered Fiona Dade, not as the blacksmith's widow, not as the woman who'd come west on a prayer and a one-way ticket, but as the woman who'd kicked in a lawman's door at 7 in the morning and walked out with a warrant she'd written herself. But that came later. It always does. Let's go back to where it started. To the afternoon, Owen Schraft stood on the platform at Cheyenne Station with a sign that said wife in letters so large a man 2 cars down could read it. He'd meant it to say Miss Hutchins, but he'd run out of wood. Fiona Rosalind Hutchins stepped off the 240 from Kansas City, carrying a canvas bag, a rolled-up leather apron, and an expression that could strip paint. She was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of Scottish-Irish stubbornness, with red-brown hair that refused to stay pinned and hands already calloused from 2 years of working her late uncle's forge. She saw the sign. She stopped. The man holding it was not what the letters had suggested. Owen Schraft was somewhere north of 40, raw-boned and wind-scared, with a kind of quiet that either meant wisdom or emptiness. He wore no hat, which struck her as strange for Wyoming. His coat was too big in the shoulders and too short in the arms, like it had belonged to someone else originally, and he'd never bothered to find one that fit. He said, "Miss Hutchins." She said, "That sign is embarrassing." He said, "I know." She picked up her bag and walked past him toward the street. He caught up after a moment. "I've got a wagon." "I figured you didn't expect me to walk 20 miles. 18, she repeated, like the 2 miles mattered. They didn't speak again until they'd cleared the edge of town, and the road opened up into the wide, flat country that stretched toward the mountains. Then Fiona said, "Your advertisement said established operation. It is established." "How many head?" 63. "Was 80, but we had a rough winter." "How rough?" "Lost a barn, half the hay stores, and my last 2 hired hands quit in February." She turned to look at him. He was watching the road with the focused attention of a man who'd rather look at horses than people. "And you thought the solution was a wife," she said. "I thought the solution was someone who wouldn't quit in February." That was the most honest thing she'd heard from a man in years. She didn't say so. She looked back at the road instead and thought about what she'd left behind. Her uncle's forge in Abilene, sold for almost nothing after the bank got through with it. Her cousin's spare room where she'd slept for 6 weeks on a cot that creaked every time she breathed. The advertisement she'd found folded inside a church bulletin that someone had left on the pew beside her. Wyoming rancher seeks capable woman for marriage and partnership. No illusions offered. No illusions. She'd read it 3 times before she wrote back. The homestead appeared as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, painting everything amber and rust. It was smaller than the advertisement implied. A 2-room cabin, a newer barn that still smelled of raw pine, a bunkhouse that looked empty, fencing that ran straight in some places and crooked in others. A creek cut through the north pasture, catching the last light. Fiona stood in the wagon before climbing down, taking it in the way she'd learned to take in a new forge, looking for what worked, what didn't, what could be fixed with effort, and what couldn't be fixed at all. "The fence on the east side," she said. "I know, and your water trough's cracked. I know that too." She climbed down without waiting for his hand. "Where do I sleep?" He showed her the back room. It held a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that faced east. Bare walls, bare floor, bare as a cell. She set her bag on the bed and hung her leather apron on the hook behind the door. When she came back out, Owen had put coffee on the stove and was standing at the table not looking at anything in particular. "I want to be clear about something," Fiona said. He waited. "I came out here because I needed a start and you needed help. That's the honest version of why either of us is standing here. I'm not going to pretend it's anything else, and I'd appreciate if you didn't either." Owen poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table near her. "I put it in the letters." "You did." She pulled out the chair and sat. "So we understand each other." "I think so." "Good." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "Tell me about the operation," he told her. She asked questions, specific ones, the kind that came from knowing how labor actually worked rather than how it looked on paper. He answered them without trying to make things sound better than they were. By the time the coffee was gone, she had a clearer picture of the place than he'd had in 6 months of running it alone. "You're understaffed," she said. "I know. Can you afford a hand for spring?" "Maybe one." "Depends on what the cattle bring. Then we'll have to be 2 people doing 4 people's work until then." He looked at her across the table. "You ever worked cattle before?" "I've worked everything before," Fiona said. "That's what happens when you're the only one left." The first week was something close to warfare. Not between them, exactly. More like a war that each of them was waging against the sheer amount of work that had accumulated over a bad winter and a longer loneliness. Fiona learned the cattle, and the cattle learned her, which took 3 days and one incident where a temperamental steer named by the previous hand knocked her flat into the mud. She got up, caught the rope, and finished what she'd started. Owen watched from across the fence and didn't say anything, which she appreciated more than sympathy. She found the forge. It was in the back of the barn, half buried under old harness and broken tool handles. A proper farrier's setup, dusty and cold, that had clearly belonged to someone who'd left without taking it. She cleared it out in an afternoon, sharpened the tools, and had the cracked water trough replaced with a proper iron one by the end of the week. Owen came out of the barn and stopped when he saw it. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked.
"My uncle," she said, banking the coals. "He had a forge in Abilene for 30 years. I worked it from the time I was 12. I didn't know you were a blacksmith. I didn't think it was relevant to put in a letter." He was quiet for a moment. "It's relevant."
That evening he made dinner, something plain with salt pork and potatoes, and she realized it was the first meal she hadn't made since she arrived. She ate without comment. He watched her with a look she couldn't quite read. Not quite curiosity. Something more careful than that.
"How long was your uncle's operation?" he asked.
"Long enough that I thought it would outlast him."
She pushed her plate aside. "It didn't. I'm sorry. People always are. Doesn't help much." He didn't push.
She noticed that. Owen Schraft was a man who didn't push into the silences, just let them sit. She'd been around enough people who couldn't tolerate quiet to know it was rarer than it looked. They married 3 weeks later in the county seat, with the land register secretary as witness, and the whole ceremony lasting 12 minutes. Fiona wore her good dress, which was dark green wool, and had 2 small moth holes in the left sleeve that she'd turned inward so they didn't show. Owen wore a coat that actually fit him, which she suspected he'd borrowed.
When the judge asked if she took Owen to be her lawfully wedded husband, she said,
"Yes, under the terms discussed," and the judge looked up from his papers.
Owen said quietly, "That counts." The judge agreed it counted. On the ride home, Owen said, "We didn't discuss terms." "We did," Fiona said. "We just called it a conversation about the cattle operation."
He almost smiled. She was beginning to learn what that looked like. A particular stillness at the corner of his mouth, a slight change in the angle of his head. He was a man who'd spent a long time keeping expressions to himself. She understood that more than she wanted to admit. Spring came wet and punishing. The creek flooded twice, taking out the east fence both times, and Fiona rebuilt it both times with the kind of methodical fury that comes from knowing you simply have to. 2 calves came early and nearly didn't make it. She and Owen spent 3 nights in the barn in rotation, keeping them warm, watching the small chests rise and fall. On the second night, somewhere around 2 in the morning, Owen said from across the barn, "What made you answer that advertisement?" She was sitting against the hay bale nearest the stall watching the smaller calf.
"Told you. Needed a start. You could have found another forge. Gone somewhere with family." "I don't have family. Neither do I," he said. And then, after a moment, "That's why I put the advertisement."
She turned to look at him. He was watching the calf with the focused attention he usually gave to things he cared about and didn't want to show. "Most men would have just hired a hand," she said. "I tried that February," he reminded her. She turned back to the calf. Outside, rain moved against the barn roof in long, slow waves. "My uncle used to say that the forge teaches you one thing above everything else," she said.
"Doesn't matter how good the metal is if you don't work it at the right time. Let it sit too long and it goes cold and you have to start over. Work it too soon and it cracks."
She paused. "I think I let too many things go cold." Owen was quiet for a long moment. Then he said,
"Then we'll work at the right time."
She didn't answer, but the quiet after it was different from the quiet before. By summer, the homestead had changed. Not dramatically. It wasn't a transformation. More like a correction. The east fence held. The cattle were healthier. The vegetable garden Fiona had planted in the south-facing strip behind the cabin came up thick and useful. She'd repaired 4 sets of tack from neighboring ranches and charged fair prices for it, and the word spread the way word does in open country.
Slowly at first, then all at once. People started coming by.
Not in large numbers, but enough. A rancher named Pollard brought 2 horses that needed reshoeing and stayed to talk about the water rights dispute running through the southern part of the county. A woman named June, whose husband ran a sheep operation 2 ridges over, stopped with preserves and a question about whether Fiona could mend a broken gate latch, and stayed for coffee and 2 hours of conversation that felt like the first real conversation Fiona had had since Kansas. Owen watched his wife settle into the valley with the same quiet attention he gave everything. He noticed when she was tired and didn't say so. He noticed when the work at the forge was going wrong and said nothing because she'd figure it out. He noticed the way she talked to the cattle, not sweetly, the way people sometimes do, but practically, like she was working out a problem out loud and the animal was good enough company to think alongside. He built her a proper work table for the forge in August. Didn't mention it.
Just had it there one morning when she came out. She ran her hands along the edge of it and said, "This is good work." Neighbor helped.
Man named Ellsworth who used to do carpentry.
You told him what I needed? I measured your other table and described it. She looked at the table for another moment.
Then she looked at him.
Thank you.
He nodded and went back to the horses. That evening she played the small concertina she'd kept in the bottom of her canvas bag since Abilene, the one her uncle had bought secondhand and played badly and taught her to play well. Owen sat on the porch steps and listened without comment. When she finished, he said,
I didn't know you played. You never asked. What else didn't I ask?
She thought about it. I was engaged once. In Abilene. To a merchant's son who thought a wife with calloused hands was a problem to be solved.
What happened?
I left him, she said simply. Walked out 2 weeks before the wedding. Caused a considerable amount of gossip and one very angry family. She set the concertina on her knee.
You're not surprised? No, Owen said. Most men would be. Most men would have tried to fix the calloused hands.
She looked at him in the low evening light, at this man who had spent 9 months trying to figure out how to ask for help and had finally written an advertisement with no illusions offered.
Owen, yeah, I think I might actually like you.
He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I've been waiting to see if you'd notice. Then, because nothing in Wyoming stays quiet for long, the trouble started. It came in the form of a man named Carol Yount, which was a name that half the county already knew, and not for good reasons. Yount ran the largest cattle operation in Harlan County, had done for 20 years, and had a particular habit of expanding that operation in ways that stopped just short of illegal, and sometimes didn't bother stopping at all. He came to their homestead on a Thursday in September with 2 men behind him, and a manner that suggested he expected the visit to go a certain way.
Schraft, he said from his horse.
He didn't dismount, which told Fiona everything she needed to know about the visit. Owen came out of the barn, wiping his hands.
Yount, I'll be direct. Yount looked at the operation the way a man looks at something he's already decided to take.
Your north pasture runs along my fence line. I've got a proposition about the water access from that creek. I've heard your propositions before, Owen said.
This is a new one.
Yount's eyes moved to Fiona, who was standing at the corner of the barn with a farrier's hammer she hadn't put down. She didn't respond. Yount laid out the proposition. It was dressed up in neighborly language, but came down to this. He wanted shared access to the creek in exchange for what he called protection and consideration, which meant nothing good.
Owen said no. Yount said he'd hope Owen would reconsider. Owen said he'd already considered, and the answer was no. After they rode out, Fiona said, He'll be back. He always comes back. What's he done before?
Owen told her. 3 years of it. Cattle pushed through fences. A well that went bad the same week. Yount sent a man around asking about buying the east acreage. A hired hand who quit after something he wouldn't fully explain. Nothing provable. Nothing that the county sheriff, a man named Bascom who owed Yount in ways too numerous to count, had ever done anything about. And the sheriff, Fiona said. In Yount's pocket. She was quiet for a moment.
Then we build something Yount can't touch. Like what? Proof, she said. Documentation. And neighbors who aren't afraid of him. Owen looked at her. You sound like you've done this before. I've rebuilt a forge from nothing twice. The principle's the same. You can't fight heat with heat. You have to change the shape of the thing.
She started with the documentation. Every incident.
Dates, descriptions, witnesses where there were any.
She wrote letters to other small ranchers in the county, careful ones, asking neutral questions about their experiences with water rights and fence disputes. The answers came back careful at first, then less so. June's husband, a quiet Scotsman named Brody, came by in October with 2 other ranchers she hadn't met, and they sat at Owen's table and talked for 3 hours about what Yount had been doing for years to people who didn't have the land or the standing to push back. Brody had kept records himself, meticulous ones, in a ledger his wife had maintained since they arrived.
You're building a case, Owen said that night after everyone had left. I'm building the shape of a case, Fiona corrected. The case needs a lawyer. Closest one worth trusting is in Laramie. Then someone's going to Laramie.
She went. Took 2 days on horseback. Presented her documentation to an attorney named Harlow, who dealt in land and water disputes, and came back with a letter that laid out exactly what would be needed to bring a complaint before the Territorial Land Commission. Yount found out, because he always found out. He sent a man around, not himself this time, one of the quiet ones, who said that Mrs. Schraft should be careful about making accusations she couldn't support, and that accidents happened in ranch country, especially in winter. Fiona looked at the man for a long moment.
Then she said,
Tell Carol Yount that I fixed a forge with one hand after I broke the other one, and I'd recommend he think very carefully about what he means by accident. The man left Owen had been at the other end of the barn. He came over slowly and stood beside her. That might have made things worse, he said.
Maybe.
She picked up the hammer she'd set down. Or maybe he thinks twice about a woman who isn't afraid of him. Owen was quiet for a moment. Are you afraid of him?
She thought about it honestly. I'm afraid of losing this. The homestead. What we've built. She looked at him. I'm not afraid of him. Neither am I, Owen said, anymore.
She looked at him, and something shifted in the space between them, something that had been building since February, since the barn in the rain, since the work table that appeared without comment. She kissed him before she knew she was going to. He kissed her back like he'd been waiting with reasonable patience for exactly that.
When they broke apart, he said, I should have done that in September. Why didn't you? I wasn't sure you wanted me to. Owen, she said, I have never done anything I didn't want to do. He almost smiled, and this time it made it all the way.
December brought hard cold and the news they'd been waiting for and dreading. Yount had filed his own complaint with the county land office, claiming that the Schraft fence line encroached on his grazing rights. It was a lie with just enough technical language around it to look like a dispute. Sheriff Bascom told Owen that pending resolution, they should refrain from any improvements to the north pasture. Fiona read the letter twice. Then she went to see Bascom herself. The sheriff's office was a single-room building on the main street of the county seat that smelled of tobacco and old paper. Bascom was a large man with a large chair and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no by someone he couldn't dismiss. He looked at Fiona Schraft with an expression that expected her to be nervous.
She was not nervous.
She laid her documentation on his desk. Dates, incidents, a signed statement from Brody and his wife, a letter from attorney Harlow in Laramie outlining the pattern of intimidation, and 3 statements from other ranchers who had finally decided, with some encouragement, that they were tired of being afraid. This is a water and fence dispute, Bascom said. This is evidence of a coordinated effort to push small ranchers off their land, Fiona said. And I'd like you to look at it carefully, because copies of everything here have already been sent to the Territorial Land Commission in Cheyenne, and the next letter goes to the district attorney's office.
Bascom stared at her. Ma'am, you're making a serious accusation. I'm making an accurate one.
She gathered her copies carefully. I grew up watching my uncle fight for 30 years to keep his forge because men with more money than ethics decided his land was more useful to them than to him. He lost. She looked at Bascom directly.
I don't intend to.
She walked out. She did not kick in the door on the way out. That came later, in a different year, over a different injustice, but she walked through it like it already belonged to the truth rather than to Carol Yount's preferred version of things. The Land Commission's investigation began in January. It was slow, cold, methodical work. They submitted records. Harlow drove up from Laramie twice to review documents. Yount hired a lawyer who was expensive and loud and confident, which told Fiona that Yount was more worried than he looked. The other ranchers held firm, which surprised some people and shouldn't have. People hold firm when they believe the ground beneath them will hold. Through all of it, the homestead kept running. That was the thing people forgot to mention when they talked about that winter later. Fiona and Owen didn't stop working while the case built. The cattle needed feeding, the forge needed stoking, the east fence needed a third repair after a hard frost cracked a post. They worked through it the way they'd been working since the beginning, together, without ceremony, with the specific competence of 2 people who had stopped wasting time pretending they didn't need each other. Owen came in late one February evening to find Fiona at the table going over the Land Commission paperwork for what must have been the 15th time. He sat down across from her without speaking and looked at her until she looked up. You need to sleep, he said.
I need this to be right. It's right. He put his hand flat on the papers. Fiona, it's right. You built it right.
She looked at his hand on the papers, then she looked at him.
He had a particular way of looking at her that she'd started to recognize.
Not the careful, evaluating look from those first weeks, but something more settled, like she was a fixed point he used to find his direction.
What if it isn't enough, she said. Then we figure out the next thing. That's not an answer. No, he agreed, but it's what we've got.
She put her hand over his. They sat like that for a while, the fire going down, the wind moving outside, the paperwork sitting under both their hands like the foundation of something that hadn't been tested yet. The commission ruled in March. Yount's complaint was dismissed. The encroachment claim was found to have no basis in the original survey documents. 2 of the incidents documented in Fiona's submission were referred to the district attorney's office for review. Carol Yount was not a man who went to prison, not that year, though he had worse years ahead of him, but his ability to run the southern part of the county like a private kingdom was finished, and everyone who lived there knew it. The day the ruling came, Brody rode over with his wife June and a bottle of something that wasn't quite whiskey but was close enough, and 3 other ranching families followed. They ate and drank in the cabin and spilled out onto the porch when it got warm enough, and Fiona played the concertina until her fingers ached. Owen stood in the doorway watching her, the same way he'd stood in the doorway of the barn watching her work on the first day she'd cleared the forge out. She caught his eye. He nodded once, the way he did when something was exactly what it should be.
There are some stories that end with the winning. This one kept going, the way real ones do.
Fiona Schraft worked the forge for 31 more years. She became the best farrier in Harlan County, and possibly in the whole southeastern corner of Wyoming, which she would have said was a low bar and other people would have told her was not. She trained 2 apprentices, both women, both of whom went on to their own operations. She expanded the cattle herd twice, argued with Owen about it twice, and was right both times, which she never mentioned because she didn't need to. Owen Schraft turned out to be a man who got better rather than harder as he got older, which is the rarer thing and the more valuable. He learned to say what he thought, in more words than one at a time. He learned that his wife was almost always right about the cattle, and sometimes wrong about people, and that you didn't have to say so when she figured it out herself. He learned that the homestead he'd spent 6 years building alone was nothing to what 2 people could make of it, which is a lesson that sounds simple and isn't. They had 2 children, a daughter born in the spring of 1892, who grew up to be a doctor in Cheyenne and had her mother's hands and her father's quiet. A son born 3 years later who learned both the forge and the cattle, and eventually took over the homestead when his parents got too old to run it properly, which was later than most people expected and exactly when Fiona decided. June and Brody remained their closest neighbors for 40 years until Brody died in a warm September, and June moved into town to live near her sister. Fiona visited her every week until June's own death, and people in the county who'd known them all their lives said it was the kind of friendship that held up entire communities from the inside without anyone seeing it. Carroll Yount lost his operation in 1898 to a combination of bad cattle prices and legal complications that had been building for years. He moved east, and no one in Harlan County particularly missed him. Sheriff Bascom retired the following year and was not replaced by anyone Yount had approved of, which was not a coincidence. When people in the valley asked Fiona later what the secret was, to the homestead, to the operation, to any of it, she'd look at them with an expression that suggested the question was missing something obvious. "There's no secret," she'd say.
You find somebody who doesn't quit when it gets cold, and you don't quit either. Everything else follows. Owen, if he was nearby when she said it, would say nothing. Just that slight stillness at the corner of his mouth. He'd been saying it that way since the beginning.